I want to show you something, but first, I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe isn't speculation. It isn't reinterpretation. It isn't a metaphor for colonial exploitation dressed up in provocative language. It is literal. It happened. It was photographed, advertised, attended by millions, endorsed by governments, sponsored by scientific institutions, and operated in the capitals of the most supposedly civilized nations on Earth for over a century. They put human beings in enclosures and sold tickets for other human beings to watch them. They called them exhibitions, ethnological expositions, living displays, colonial showcases. The language was always careful, always scientific sounding, always draped in the vocabulary of education and progress. But the function was the same function as any zoo you've ever visited. Living beings, confined to artificial environments, displayed for the curiosity and entertainment of paying spectators. Except the beings weren't animals, they were people. Indigenous people from Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, the Arctic, South America. Men, women, and children taken from their communities, transported across oceans, and placed behind fences in European and American cities so that white audiences could stare at them, point at them, photograph them, and go home feeling they had learned something about the world. This happened from the mid-1800s until 1958, not 1858, 1958, the year NASA was founded. The year the European Economic Community held its first meeting. The year the modern world was allegedly already modern. And in Brussels, that year, at the World's Fair, the Belgian government operated a Congolese village as a living exhibit. Congolese people, behind a fence, on display. Visitors threw bananas at them. In 1958. And then it stopped. And then the silence began. Because here's what I can't reconcile. An institution that operated for over 100 years, that was attended by hundreds of millions of people across dozens of countries, that was photographed and written about and advertised in newspapers and promoted by governments, has been almost completely erased from mainstream historical memory. You didn't learn about this in school. It doesn't appear in the standard narrative of colonialism that most Western education provides. It occupies a strange, ghostly space in the historical record, simultaneously documented and invisible, proven and forgotten. The silence was deafening. Start at the beginning, or at least at the point where the practice became industrialized. The 1870s. Carl Hagenbeck, a German animal dealer and zoo entrepreneur, is generally credited with commercializing the human exhibition. He had been importing exotic animals for European zoos for years and realized that importing exotic people would draw even bigger crowds. His first major exhibition in 1874 displayed Samoan and Sami people in Hamburg. It was a sensation. Thousands attended, and Hagenbeck, a businessman above all else, recognized that he had found something more profitable than elephants. Within a decade, human exhibitions were appearing across Europe. Paris, London, Berlin, Barcelona, Milan, Antwerp. They weren't hidden in back alleys or operated by fringe showmen. They were staged in the most prestigious venues available: national exhibitions, world's fairs, colonial expositions, public parks and gardens. The 1889 Paris World's Fair, the same event that unveiled the Eiffel Tower, featured a Negro village where approximately 400 indigenous people were displayed. Over 28 million people attended that fair. The human exhibits were among the most popular attractions. This raises a simple but critical question. How does an entire civilization look at human beings in enclosures and see education? The answer, and the deeper I went, the clearer it became, is that they were told what to see. The scientific establishment of the 19th century provided the framework. Evolutionary theory, or rather its grotesque misapplication, had created a hierarchy of human development. Europeans at the top, everyone else arranged below in descending order of supposed civilization. The human zoo was presented not as cruelty, but as science. Visitors weren't gawking, they were observing. They weren't being entertained by captive people. They were studying living examples of earlier stages of human evolution. The enclosure wasn't a cage, it was a laboratory. The people inside weren't prisoners, they were specimens. The language of science did what it has always done when placed in the service of power. It made the unthinkable sound reasonable. It gave the public permission to look without guilt. It transformed an atrocity into a curriculum. And the scale. The scale is what makes this impossible to dismiss as a peripheral phenomenon. The 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis displayed over 1,000 indigenous people from around the world. The Philippine reservation alone covered 47 acres and contained 1,200 Filipinos arranged in tribal groupings for American visitors to observe. The fair's anthropology department explicitly designed the exhibits to demonstrate racial hierarchy, arranging groups from least civilized to most civilized across the fairgrounds so that visitors would experience a literal walk through the supposed stages of human development. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across decades and continents. The 1897 Brussels International Exposition displayed 260 Congolese people. The 1907 Paris Colonial Exhibition drew 2 million visitors to view indigenous people from French colonies. The 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition, one of the largest events in French history, attracted 34 million visitors over 6 months. 34 million. The exhibits included reconstructed villages from Indochina, Madagascar, West Africa, and the Pacific, all populated with living people performing their supposed cultural roles for French audiences. And it wasn't just Europe. In the United States, Ota Benga, a Mbuti man from the Congo, was displayed in the Monkey House at the Bronx Zoo in 1906. In the Monkey House, alongside primates. The zoo's director placed him there deliberately as a living illustration of the supposed link between Africans and apes. Thousands visited. Newspapers covered it. Some African American ministers protested. The New York Times responded by essentially defending the exhibit, suggesting the critics were overreacting. Ota Benga was eventually released from the zoo. He spent years struggling to build a life in America, unable to return home, unable to escape the trauma of what had been done to him. He died in 1916. He was 32 years old. I need you to sit with that for a moment. A human being was displayed in a cage with monkeys in the largest city in the United States, and the newspaper of record suggested that objecting to this was an overreaction. Now, the ending. And this is where the story becomes, if possible, even more disturbing. The human zoos didn't end because of a moral revolution. They didn't end because the public rose up in outrage, because a great reformer shamed the nations into stopping, because the scientific community suddenly recognized the obscenity of what it had endorsed. They ended incrementally, quietly, without a definitive moment of reckoning. The last major exhibition, Brussels, 1958, closed, and the practice simply wasn't repeated. No declaration, no apology, no formal acknowledgement that what had been done was wrong. The official explanation collapses here, because when an institution that vast, that public, that deeply embedded in the cultural and scientific establishment of multiple nations simply stops, there should be a reason, a documented reason, a debate, a turning point. The abolition of slavery had its abolitionists. The end of legal segregation had its movement. The end of human zoos had nothing except silence. The deeper I went, the more that silence started to look deliberate. Not a conspiracy of active suppression, but something perhaps more effective. A collective agreement to simply stop talking about it. to let it slide from living memory into archival obscurity, to treat it not as a crime that required accountability, but as an embarrassment that required forgetting. And the forgetting has been remarkably successful. Ask an educated European about human zoos and watch what happens: confusion, disbelief, sometimes outright denial. These were events attended by tens of millions of people, staged in the most prominent public spaces in the Western world, and within 2 generations they have been effectively memory-holed. Not because the evidence was destroyed. The evidence exists. Photographs, postcards, newspaper accounts, attendance records, government documents, all of it survives. But it exists in archives, in academic databases, in the kind of specialized historical scholarship that never reaches the general public. The photographs are the most haunting part, because thousands of photographs were taken at these exhibitions. They were sold as postcards. They were published in newspapers and magazines. They were collected in albums. For decades, these images circulated openly as souvenirs of a pleasant day out. And then they stopped circulating, not because they were confiscated or burned. They simply ceased to be reproduced. They were not included in history books. They were not displayed in museums. They were not shown in documentaries. They remained in archives, technically available, practically invisible. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Here's what I keep returning to. The people in those photographs had names. They had families. They had communities and languages and traditions and entire worlds of meaning that existed before they were scooped up and shipped across oceans and placed behind fences for strangers to photograph. Many of them died in the exhibitions, from diseases they had no immunity to, from the cold, from conditions that their bodies were never meant to endure. Their deaths were recorded in institutional files with the same clinical detachment used to record the death of a zoo animal. Cause of death, date, disposition of remains, disposition of remains. That phrase, repeated across dozens of exhibition records, opens another layer of this history that most people aren't prepared for. Many of the people who died in human zoos were not returned to their communities for burial. Their bodies were sent to museums, to scientific collections. Their bones were catalogued, measured, studied, and stored. Human remains from these exhibitions sat in the collections of major European natural history museums well into the 21st century. Some are still there. The process of repatriation, of returning these remains to their communities of origin, is ongoing, incomplete, and in many cases, actively resisted by the institutions that hold them. The living display didn't end at death. Even the dead remained specimens. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision when you examine what replaced the human zoo. Because the display of otherness didn't stop in 1958. It changed form. The logic of the human zoo, the idea that non-Western peoples exist as objects of curiosity for Western audiences, migrated into new media, into National Geographic spreads that displayed indigenous bodies with a clinical gaze indistinguishable from the exhibition catalog, into reality television programs that send cameras into remote communities and broadcast their lives as entertainment, into tourism industries that market indigenous cultures as experiences to be consumed. The fence was removed. The ticket price changed form. The gaze remained. And this is the part that I think matters most. The human zoo wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a bizarre footnote to an otherwise progressive history. It was the logical expression of a world view that divided humanity into those who observe and those who are observed, those who display and those who are displayed, those who write the captions and those who are captioned. That worldview wasn't defeated when the last exhibition closed. It was redistributed across systems so diffuse that we stopped recognizing it as the same thing. I'm not telling you that looking at a National Geographic article is the same as visiting a human zoo. I'm asking why the visual grammar is so similar. Why the framing of the other as exotic, as primitive, as existing for our educational enrichment persists so naturally that we don't even notice it? I'm asking why the end of the human zoo produced no reckoning, no memorial, no sustained cultural confrontation with what it meant that the most educated, most scientifically advanced, most self-congratulatory civilization in human history put people in cages and called it learning. I'm asking why you didn't know about this until now. Because that's the real question underneath all the others, not why did human zoos exist. Power explains that easily enough. Not why did they end. Changing political conditions explain that. But why were they forgotten? Why was the most extensively documented, most widely attended, most publicly celebrated form of racial dehumanization in modern history allowed to simply fade from collective memory without a fight? What does it mean that a society can do something this visible, this public, this enormous in scale, and then simply choose not to remember it? Not through censorship, not through book burning, through something quieter, through the simple, devastating act of not including it in the story we tell about ourselves. The deeper I went, the more I understood that the erasure wasn't a failure of memory. It was a success of narrative. The story of Western civilization as a march of progress from darkness to enlightenment cannot accommodate human zoos in 1958. It cannot absorb the fact that the generation that fought fascism also sold tickets to watch Congolese families behind fences. It cannot reconcile the self-image of the liberator with the photographic evidence of the captor. So the evidence is not denied. It is simply not mentioned, not taught, not included, left in archives where only specialists will find it, technically available, effectively invisible, handed a story about civilization and told it was the whole story. What else have we been handed and never thought to question?